I am so thrilled to have my next guest. He is widely regarded as the greatest Formula One race car designer in the history of the sport. Please welcome the great Adrian Newey. Welcome to the Art of Excellence. In the words of Aristotle, excellence is never an accident. It is always the result of high intention, sincere effort, and intelligent execution. I am your host, Glenn Zweig. Join me now as I dive into the lives and careers of world-class entrepreneurs, athletes, entertainers, scientists, thought leaders, and explorers to uncover the ingredients to their extraordinary accomplishments. My guest today is Adrian Newey. Adrian is Chief Technical Officer for Red Bull Racing. He has won 13 Drivers' Championships and 12 Constructors' Championships across 3 teams in his career. He is widely regarded as the greatest Formula One race car designer in the history of the sport. Adrian, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Absolutely thrilled to have you. So here's where I want to start. I don't know if this news has made it across the ocean, but there's this new blockbuster racing movie being made starring Brad Pitt called F1. And I'm sure, as you know, there was this Netflix hit series, Formula One Drive to Survive, over the last few years. So does it ever bother you that all the public attention seems to be focused on the driver and not the race car designer? Or do you actually enjoy sort of, working behind the scenes away from the public eye?
I'm quite happy behind the scenes and kind of relatively out of the public eye. I'm lucky enough to be doing the job I wanted to do since the age of 10 or 11 of being a designer in the racing industry. I think what is a shame, though, about Drive to Survive, obviously I can't comment on Brad Pitt's new movie, but on Drive to Survive, is it kind of takes the football model of concentrating on the 2 drivers as the 2 players and the team principal, i.e. the coach, as the star characters. And it doesn't show the sheer depth and breadth of the work that goes into putting those 2 cars on the grid. All the big Formula One teams now, 800 plus people, and it's a huge amount of expertise that goes into researching, designing, manufacturing, and operating those cars. And I think for the public, it just feels like a wasted opportunity that a lot of people appreciate behind the scenes, and it doesn't show the true behind the scenes, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned 10 or 11 years old when you first thought about this. And it's really interesting to me that you thought about designing racing cars when you were 10 or 11, because it's such a specific field. And we're not talking about the desire to one day race these cars, which I could see that being as big as being an astronaut or a fireman or something like that, but actually designing them. So what was the allure for you back then?
That's a good question. It's a question I've asked myself from time to time. And I don't have a really good answer. My dad was a vet, was a veterinary surgeon, obviously no obvious link there. But he also enjoyed his cars. He had a couple of Lotus Salans, which in those days arrived as kits, I think, to avoid car tax. So the second one in particular, by then I was old enough to be able to help him. I think one of the keys that always stands out in my memory is that for my 10th birthday, my parents bought me a Tamiya 12th scale model of a Lotus 49, and that would have been 1968. And so I put that model together, and those models are great because all the parts are labeled, the correct name, the front top wishbone or the front upright or whatever it might be. But more importantly, perhaps they showed you how a racing car went together, the front suspension bolts to the chassis, bolts to the engine, bolts to the gearbox, bolts to the rear suspension, etc. And I was just fascinated by that and how it all went together. And I think the combination of that and my dad tinkering around on his Mini Cooper S's and then Lotus Lands and so forth, it just sparked my interest. What I then did is I built a few of these Tamiya models, and then by the time I was about 12, I built, I don't know, 3 or 4 of them, and I got a little bit bored almost with building other people's designs, so I started sketching my own ideas. Of course, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing or what I was sketching or drawing, and then using my dad's workshop to fold up bits of aluminium and make bits of fiberglass and stuff to create my own designs. And as I said, I didn't know what I was doing. I was just trying to guess and invent and get inside the head of the designers of the time. But I think what I was completely unwittingly doing was practicing the 1,000-hour rule, that from a very young age, I was doing that thing of thinking about something, sketching it down on a piece of paper, and in this case, actually then turning it into a 3D object. And that really is the essence of my job nowadays.
Amazing. By the way, 10,000-hour rule, which I know Malcolm Gladwell sort of popularized, that came originally from a researcher named Anders Ericsson, who coincidentally I had on my podcast some years ago before he passed away. So you've said before that a good design engineer needs to be both left brain and right brain. That is combining the artistic, imaginative left side with the analytical and practical right side. And so you mentioned your dad was a vet. I think he also was somewhat on the side immersed in the world of math and engineering. Your mother, you had mentioned, was more artistic between the two. So it sort of seems like you're a hybrid of the two, right? This engineering mindset with a design sensibility.
I think that's exactly right. On both my mother's side and my father's side, there's quite a lot of artistic content. Both my grandmothers were very good artists. My mother was a good artist. I'm left-handed, which I think is a sign of the artistic side of the brain as well. Indeed, I went to a convent school and was forced to sit on my left hand. So at the age of 6, I still couldn't write until I finally changed school and could use the correct hand. You was actually right that for me, engineering or design engineering is really that combination of creativity. The spark has to come somewhere, but then if you like, the scientific discipline to develop that idea. And because ultimately in Formula One, there's only one master really, and that's the stopwatch. So there's no kind of doing something that's artistic that has no real technical merit. It just doesn't work.
Well, one would think, just listening with all the maths and engineering and design behind this, that you must have been this really incredible student. And not so much the case. Yeah, you struggled in school, didn't have good grades, even somewhat of a troublemaker. Were you just struggling with the coursework, or you just didn't care?
I suppose I never really enjoyed school that much, both academically in and out of school. Found some of the lessons a bit boring. I was reasonably good at maths and physics. I was actually better at the arts subjects than I was at the scientific subjects, though. So kind of art was probably my strongest subject. I was okay at English and history, and indeed the advice from my careers advisor, going from 16 to 18, where in the UK you have to choose three or four subjects and study them from 16 to 18, is to do art, English and history. But the art I like the idea of, but I wanted to be a racing car designer, as I said, and I knew that I would need maths and physics and a bit of practical experience as well. So I ignored that, and at the same time I got chucked out of school anyway. So I went to the local technical college and studied a thing called an OND, which was a much more, perhaps a bit too practically based, because my theory and my maths in particular at the age of 18 when I used to go to uni was a bit weak. But yeah, I found school kind of just a bit boring, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, well, let's rewind the tape. You skipped over I got kicked out of school. What was behind that? What the heck did you do?
Well, I went to this. My father and his father went to this quite Dickensian public school in the north of England near Derby, which was a boarding school. And I never really got on with boarding particularly. I think maybe I was a slightly geeky, slightly awkward kid. And so I got bullied a little bit. I wasn't fantastic at sport, and those schools, to be really popular, needs to be good at sport. So I kind of just did my own thing and stuff. And by the time I was 16, I had a small group of friends. And the treat of at the end of the summer term was the sixth form. I was only a fifth former. The sixth form could organise a end of term concert, end of year concert, pop concert. And so they managed to get a band, Greenslade. This was 1975, so it was that sort of very atmospheric organ music. And the concert was held in an 11th century building, a building that the school was very proud of because the stained glass window had survived Cromwell and all those things and was still there. Anyway, we got hold of a whole load of half bottles of gin and vodka and so forth. And in those days, the trousers were very baggy, flared trousers. I said, let's take them to our shins with duct tape, which we did. Snuck in and then bought the mixers, the Coke or the lemonade or whatever inside. And I got seriously hammered, I'm afraid. And towards the end of the concert, there was a little sound mixing booth. I can still remember it so clearly. And I guess the mixing guy had gone off to the loo or something, and left the little side door open. So I slid all the sliders to maximum, and then conked out unconscious on top of them. And the resulting racket meant that the headmaster appeared to see what was going on, found me kind of, as I said, unconscious over the sliders. So I was taken off to the school sanitarium, given a stomach pump, which was a bit unnecessary and unpleasant. And then they found that the stained glass window was not broken, but let's say a bit loose. All the leading was somewhat looser than it had been. It was all a bit fragile. So I telephoned my parents and said, look, I'm afraid your boy's not welcome anymore. You're going to have to take him away. That's it. We've had enough of him. So my mum arrived, and she knew the headmaster liked potted plants. So she walked in with a big lily, and here, Mr. Gammon, I know you like potted plants. Here's a lily for you. Thank you, Mrs. Newey. And so my little Adrian, he's such a good little boy, isn't he? And he said, well, no, I'm afraid he's been actually a very, very bad boy. My mum said, oh, well, so now what happens? Well, I'm afraid you're going to have to take him away. Oh, well, in that case, took the plant. Adrian, let's go. And that was that. That was the end of my school career.
School career. Well, fortunately, there'd be another career later in life. So back to university, you were talking about. You ended up studying aerodynamics, but as I understand it, and feel free to correct me, you still struggled at university with math, and I would think math is a pretty foundational element for design engineering, for aerodynamic modeling, and these kinds of things. So did you learn to get good at it, or you learn to get good at your craft, at your expertise, despite having that as a weak link?
Well, strictly speaking, I studied aeronautical engineering, of which aerodynamics was one of the subjects.
Okay.
And I chose aeronautical engineering on the basis that I figured racing cars were closer in their technology to aeronautics, to aircraft, than to anything else. It wasn't out of any interest in aircraft. But you're right. I've done what's called advanced maths O level at 16, which was effectively the first year of the A level course from 16 to 18. So I had, if you like, 17-year-old maths, but then had a year missing. And so when I got to uni, all the lecturers assumed that you had 18-year-old maths, if you like, and I didn't. I had some huge holes and gaps. So I really, really struggled hard in the first term, and actually by Christmas I was right on the point of giving up. But my tutor at university, a lovely man, Ken Bergen, he, for whatever reason, saw some promise in me and persuaded me to keep going and said somehow get through. And I did. I mean, my maths is still relatively weak, but I just learned how to cover it, basically. I learned an exam technique that's allowed me to get through the exams. But it's a weakness, but it's not a weakness that hinders me in my day-to-day work, because my interest in racing cars has always been performance. And in those days, 1980, when I graduated, then the mathematical side of race car engineering was minimal. You know, it's really quite simple calculations, so it didn't need it. And then as the computer age kicked in sort of early to mid 90s, and of course we do need incredibly bright mathematicians now, but by that stage the teams are big enough that we can make sure we employed the right people. But I didn't need to be that person. I just needed to say, this is what we'd like to achieve, please.
Well, I think you did your final year project on ground effect aerodynamics applied to racing cars. And decades later, optimizing this ground effect force would become a pretty ubiquitous element in designing racing cars, but of course not back then. So first, could you explain in simple terms what ground effect is? Why is it so important in terms of racing?
Ground effect is basically the presence of the ground plane modifying the flow physics around whatever object is flying or passing over that, close to that ground plane. So, if, for instance, if you look at every water bird, particularly river birds, swans, that sort of thing, they will use ground effect quite heavily. They'll fly just above the waterline, very often with their tips just touching the water on the downbeat, and they're effectively using that to give extra lift. And in racing, we turn that upside down, so that if you have a Venturi shape where you're accelerating the flow under the throat of the Venturi, you get very low pressure. That has to be a symmetry given by the ground plane, providing there's no separation. And so that helps to improve the expansion ratio, creates very low pressure, and that's what presses the car into the ground.
But you decided to study this before this was anything related to racing cars. So did you see something others didn't see?
Well, strictly speaking, Formula One was starting to exploit it at the time. It was right at the start of the exploitation of ground effect. And I was an avid reader of anything I could find about racing cars. I used to, if I could, go to the circuits, and in those days you could get very close to cars. I used to go and look at the cars and try to understand what the designers are thinking and what their principles were. And as I said, understood that one or two of the designers of the day were starting to use this ground effect phenomenon. So I thought, okay, this looks like it's going to be the way of the future. This is what I need to do my final year thesis on.
Well, so you graduate from school. You're interviewing with all the major Formula One car companies, getting turned down from all of them for lack of experience. And of course, this is the very usual catch-22 we all face entering the workforce. Then out of nowhere, you get a call from some well-known car designer. I think Harvey was the name, if memory serves. Invited you to come interview. Turns out wasn't much of an interview and sort of hired you on the spot. Could you share that story?
Yes, of course. So I was getting quite desperate because, as I said, I kind of my aspiration from this very young age was to be a designer in racing cars. I don't think I knew the word engineer. And so when as this approached graduation, I wrote around to all the teams I could find addresses for. Most didn't reply. Those that did, as you said, gave the catch-22 answer of only take people with experience. And I didn't really know what I was going to do, to be perfectly honest. Lotus Cars had offered me a job in the roadside, and that's probably what I'd have ended up doing in the hope that if I was in Lotus on the road car side, then maybe I'll be able to transfer over to the race side. And then out of the blue, Harvey Postlethwaite, who is the technical director at Fittipaldi's, tiny little Formula One team in Reading, rang me and said, "Can you come for an interview?" So I rode up on my Ducati. I didn't have any cars until I was about 24. And the Ducati was something that my parents had been very cross about, because my grandmother had very sadly passed when I was 18 and left me a bit of will money, which I responsibly used to buy the Ducati. My parents strongly felt I should put it in a building society or something. So anyway, I rode up on the Ducati. I was sitting in my leathers, and Harvey came out and saw me and said, "So you've obviously got a motorbike. What motorbike have you got?" I said, "A Ducati 900 SS." He said, "Oh, fantastic. I've got a Moto Guzzi Le Mans, which was the big rival at the time, the two Italian brands. Can I have a go on your Ducati?" And I said, "Well, please be my guest." So off he went around the industrial estate. It was a very noisy bike, so you could hear him riding around. He's gone for about 15 minutes. And then came back and big smile on his face, took his helmet off and said, "When can you start?" And that was my interview. The one interview I've had in racing.
Yeah, wow. And the rest, of course, is history. Well, just to fast forward a little bit as you get into your career, as I understand it, you're one of the few designers or technical directors, if you will, that has this multidisciplinary background. You've got design, aerodynamics or aeronautical engineering, if you will, car engineering, race engineering. Typically, people rise up through one of those paths, don't necessarily touch all of them. So I would think that would allow you to design a car with a much more holistic point of view. And so, one, curious if you agree. And if so, how would that manifest in the design process and how a car ends up coming to be?
No, you're absolutely right. So all racing teams effectively have three departments, which is aerodynamics, vehicle design, so design, drawing office called it, design office, and then vehicle dynamics, which is normally includes simulation as well. I was very lucky because when I was hired by Harvey, I was hired as a junior aerodynamicist, which turned out to be senior aerodynamicist as well. Unbelievably, I was the only aerodynamicist in the team, which, bearing in mind that at Red Bull we probably have about 80 or so aerodynamicists, then wow. It's amazing how things have changed. So I worked there at Fittipaldi's for about a year and a half, but Harvey left for Ferrari. It started to become very obvious that the team was losing its sponsorship, its backing. So I figured it was probably time to start looking at other teams. And two very senior people at Fittipaldi left. One went to Lotus and offered me a job as an aerodynamicist at Lotus. And the other went to March, which is a production manufacturer that made racing cars for lots of different series. And the offer there was to be a junior draftsman in the design office during the week, and then to be a race engineer on the Formula 2 team for one of the drivers at the weekends. And I thought, well, okay, I've done a year and a half of aerodynamics now. It'd be great to take this opportunity of learning the two other disciplines. And so that's what I did. And so by 3 years out of university, I'd had a lot of experience in aerodynamics, in starting to work my way up through the design offices from junior draftsman to kind of starting to be in charge of projects, and as a race engineer on the Formula 2 car.
And I assume, it's not just the Adrian Newey show. You've got huge teams when you're building these cars, designing and building these cars. I assume it must help the fact that you're overseeing a team and you've dabbled in each of these areas. It lets you speak their language. I'd imagine even earn their respect more than someone that isn't that familiar, with the subject matter.
In the industry now, the industry is such a big industry. We Red Bull have, I think, something around 250 engineers in total. And that really started to mushroom kind of through the 90s as revenue went up and the computer age started to kick in, and so you could actually use more engineers because you had the research tools. And the problem with that, though, is that because the departments are so big, everybody ends up specialized early on, which is a shame. I'm probably the last of the generation now that's still active in racing that has had that experience across all the three disciplines because the teams are small enough to be able to do so. And I think yes, hopefully that what that does mean is that I can take quite a holistic approach, that I can try to understand the compromises that are involved between the different functions. It's that old thing that for an aircraft, there used to be a sketch at university that the aerodynamicist wants a wing that's that thick, the structural guy wants a wing that's that thick, the control guy wants something that's got lots of rods and so forth everywhere. And so inevitably you always get compromises across departments. With my race engineering, I've also kind of hopefully got a reasonably good feel about what the driver wants out of the car. So that's the bit of the job that I really enjoy, is trying to make sure that when we produce a car, we kind of consider the whole car as an item rather than a series of little bits that you somehow nail together and hope will work. And it's that overview that I hope I can offer as our engineering team gets bigger and bigger. Of course, my individual drawing output becomes proportionally smaller, but hopefully I can still kind of give an overview.
Well, you mentioned what the driver wants out of it, which makes me curious to ask you about the driver and how they fit into the design process itself. So I imagine you have to incorporate their size. That's a component, and you're sort of designing around that to some degree, the cockpit area, if you will. But what else comes into play? Does the driver's technique or other variables have to get factored in?
They do, and it's very much what the driver wants is, and his feedback is vital. And of course, different drivers give different feedback in different ways, and different drivers want different things out of the car. My experience is that within a relatively narrow band, though, what makes the car fast for one driver will make the car fast for another driver. But of course, you do get drivers, Max Verstappen being a very good example, that is happy, well, not happy, but he is able to live with a car that's got relatively poor stability if it's faster. He would always rather have a more stable car because it's easier to drive. But if push comes to shove and we've got ourselves in a corner and the car's stability isn't brilliant, he can live with it. Other drivers can't. And sometimes you see the gap between teammates growing. That can be for two reasons. Either the car's unstable and one of the drivers is less able to deal with that instability, or the opposite end of the scale, where the car's actually too stable, it won't turn, and one driver can adapt his technique better to that than the other. It always intrigues me that now, of course, we have all these sensors on the car, literally several hundred sensors on the car. We have all the sophisticated analysis software, simulation software, and so forth. But still, the input of the driver, what the human says about the car, is a vital factor.
So the first job I ever had in my career out of college, I was at Walt Disney Imagineering. I don't know if you've heard of that group. It's the design and development group for all of the theme parks and attractions around the world.
Okay.
And I remember there would be a several month period when you're designing whether it's a new park or a specific ride, the creative design process. Before you brought in architecture and systems engineering and ride engineering and mechanical engineering, it was just a creative team, almost like imported straight out of Hollywood. When you're dealing with racing cars, is there something similar? Is when you're starting out with something new, is there a creative process that you start with before you start bringing in all of the disciplines and start going down the technical path? And maybe you could just talk a little bit about the creative design approach itself.
Yeah, no, very much so. particularly if we have a big regulation change so for the start of the 22 or over the winter of 21 going into 22 for the 22 season, then we had a huge aerodynamic regulation change, the biggest regulation change on the chassis side that we've had since 1983. And kind of then trying to think, okay, what do we want to try to achieve? What are these regulations pointing us towards? To an extent, what's the loopholes? But increasingly, the loopholes become smaller. It's a much more fundamental level. What characteristics do you want to try and achieve? How do we want to develop the car to suit these new regulations? And at that point, of course, you have nothing. Normally, cars are always iterative, but if you have a really big regulation change, especially on the aerodynamic side, at that point you have zero, and that's always an exciting time because it's the sort of the brainstorming and the ideas popping up in the shower in the morning or whatever it might be. And I think development of racing cars is always that kind of mixture of occasional bursts of inspiration mixed in with just hard graft, particularly now that we have all these wonderful simulation tools, which on the aerodynamic side with a CFD, computational fluid dynamics, which is a virtual aerodynamic simulation, then you can visualize the flow on the screen in immense detail. It makes it much easier to understand the flow structures. But equally, that becomes a very good optimization tool, but it doesn't ever give you the left field idea. I've been wearing two hats to an extent over the last few years because I've been working on the Formula One car with all the very talented engineers we have. But then at the same time, I've been working on our internal Red Bull track car project, which is a two-seater hypercar. And one of the great things about the latter is that apart from safety regulations and the constraints of putting two humans in the car and the kind of load limitations ultimately the tires will take, it's create what you like. It's kind of open book, no restrictive rule book to deal with, and that's really fun because then you can really kind of sit back and try and think of what is the best way to achieve the targets that we set ourselves for the performance of that car. We're obviously all born when we're born, but if I look back at the 1970s, which was, of course, the time when I was, not of course, but it was the time I was a teenager, sort of from 11 or 12 through university, then you went from, in the 60s, these sort of cigar-shaped cars, very simple, all reasonably pretty, but reasonably similar, to this explosion in the early 70s of different shapes as designers grappled with different ideas and so on and so forth. And it must have been fascinating because there's almost no rule book, but equally you didn't have the research tools. And so it's very much designers coming up with ideas, going off and building them. And if they worked, then I'm sure they felt very pleased with themselves. And if they didn't work, they probably felt very frustrated because they didn't understand why. Whereas now we have the opposite problem, that we've got these amazing tools and the budget to go with it, to go into incredible amounts of detail, but we're so hemmed in by a rule book that it's difficult to come up with something truly different.
Yeah. When you were explaining to me this ground effect earlier, you mentioned, I know you were explaining the opposite of it, but a bird flapping its wings near the water, which is making me think, do you ever find inspiration outside of racing? Do you ever look at the natural world for ways that might inform your point of view on what a race car could be?
I do. I mean, I think curiosity is such an important thing. So I do try to look around, be it buildings or aircraft, road cars, whatever it might be, just out of curiosity, because I think trying to understand why something's been done that way keeps your mind stimulated and open, and indeed sometimes get direct inspiration. Small example, I was doing an internal flight in the Caribbean from Barbados to one of the smaller islands some time ago, and I've been struggling with how to reduce the separation on the top of the driver's helmet as as the flow goes into the airbox just above and behind his head, and looked out of the window in his little turboprop aircraft and looked at the way the intake for the engine was under the propeller. And it was just obvious that was the solution. And that's kind of what we did and since been adopted universally in racing. So I think kind of just looking around, trying to keep your mind open is important.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned you've got these computer simulations and wind tunnels to observe how the wind moves around a car, which is a big component, of course, of how you get speed. And I read somewhere that you can actually visualize these airflows. And maybe you can tell me if it's urban legend, but that you can sort of see how air is likely to flow around a car as it makes its way around a track.
I can't actually see air molecules. I wish I could, but I can't. But I think over the years I've managed to develop a good feel, and I think that's also back to this what we were discussing right at the start, that the artistic side of the brain, giving an ability to visualize and to try to understand what's going on. Nowadays, it's much easier because of this CFD, the virtual aerodynamics. If I go back before that, because that CFD only really started to come in the mid-90s as a proper tool. And before that, it was always in the wind tunnel with a wool tuft and a Flovis, which is the green stain that you spray on and it blows around. But that only shows you what the surface flow is. It doesn't tell you what the off-surface flow is. So, and in those early days, before CFD, then you were wholly reliant on sort of wool tufts going in and then trying to sketch out and understand in your mind what the flow structures were, because you couldn't see them. But maybe that's all that practice in those early years has allowed me to perhaps intuitively understand roughly what's going on.
You know, it's interesting. All these, you're on the forefront of all these technological advancements with the design and engineering. But I read you're still old school in the sense that you like to use a drawing board in pencil over CAD, that is computer-aided design systems. And eventually your drawings make its way into the computers. But you like to start just freehand like that. And I assume you just prefer that method over using computers, and just you don't seem to be lacking technical depth though. So just curious if you could touch on that.
Yeah, sure. I think for me, it's whether you use a drawing board or a CAD system. At a fundamental level for doing layouts, and I don't think it's a big difference. For me, it's just a way of getting ideas from in the head out onto a medium and then developing them. And very often I use the rubber almost as much as I use the pencil. So by the time I've done a drawing, particularly if it's a fresh concept, I've probably rubbed out at least 50% of the lines I started with. And I think that's a very important aspect because, and that maybe is a difference, it's getting better, but certainly in the earlier CAD days, when I watched the guys working, because it was taking them quite a lot of time to get shapes down, they were quite reluctant to then modify them. They didn't use the electronic rubber as much as I was. As CAD systems have improved and technology's improved, that is less and less the case. But as I say, for me, it's my first language. It's what I grew up on. It's a drawing board. It's what I feel familiar with. And probably, I am at an age now that if I had to learn a second language, the CAD, I would always be slower and it would come less naturally to me. But equally, we certainly couldn't have too many people like me in the company because it's quite labour intensive. If I'm working flat chat, I can then keep 2 or 3 people surfaces fully loaded in terms of them scanning my drawings and then digitizing them and turning them into 3D surfaces, because nowadays everything has to end up in the computer.
You know, it's interesting. I still like holding a book. I read your book. It was written some years ago. I think it was How to Design a Car or something to that effect, sort of part memoir, part your technique and style. And it's a pretty big, heavy book, but I would carry it around with me everywhere. I just like the tactile feel of a book, despite all the e-readers and Kindles and everything out there.
I think, vinyl is obviously making a big comeback, and I
Yeah.
think people are starting to miss, as you say, the more tactile side of things.
What's old is new again, as they say. So, Adrian, if you're okay with my touching on this, I think the only fatality that's ever happened with any of your cars was back in 1994. And this was Ayrton Senna, who was the driver that had lost his life. Considered one of the greatest race car drivers ever. You were charged for manslaughter at the time, but later fully acquitted. Despite that, pretty difficult period for you?
Yeah, I mean, hugely difficult. I know this sounds really silly of me, stupid. I'd never ever thought, over the years, Formula One, motor racing in general, has of course been still a dangerous activity where there's always a risk of serious injury or loss of life. But I'd never ever thought about it. I'd never ever considered kind of what would happen if how would I feel if somebody was seriously hurt or worse in the car I'd been responsible for. And the shock of that Imola weekend was a horrible weekend from start to finish. Roland Ratzenberger lost his life on Saturday, who himself was a very close friend of Ayrton's. Rubens Barrichello had a huge accident on Friday, but thankfully he was not seriously hurt. It was just a horrible weekend, and in the following days, along with Patrick Head, our technical director, we question whether you want to be involved anymore, whether this is something you're up for or not. The manslaughter thing was in nobody's interest other than the prosecutor, who was, I think, trying to make a bit of a name for himself, frankly. Mm-hmm. He wasn't at all interested in Roland's accident. He just saw the profile. And so the manslaughter was a pressure, but it wasn't, for me, that wasn't the thing. The whole thing is, first of all, is there something I did? Did I design a part or manufacture a part or maintain the car in a way that could have contributed to that accident? That was a lot of soul searching and indeed a lot of work back at the factory to try to understand what happened and what was the cause. And I don't think we'll ever know absolutely hand in heart what happened that day. Mm-hmm. From what we can see, the accident didn't fit with a steering column failure, which was the accusation. But whatever happened, it's just a sense of waste that somebody as talented and charismatic and amazing as Ayrton was lost their life in a stupid car.
What you had touched on earlier, the trade-offs between design and engineering, and it is a series of trade-offs. I imagine a tightrope balancing the line between safety and performance when you design these cars. Did the accident reshape your design philosophy in any way?
Well, I think if we go back to certainly the earlier eras, 60s, 70s, 80s even, when I started to be involved, then the regulations for safety, you had to supply a calculation for the roll hoop. And that was and the fuel had to be contained in a bag, and really that was about it. Little or nothing in the way of safety regulations. And that did leave the designer in a conundrum. It's one that I battled with when I was designing Indy cars, where it's the same, that of course you want the car the driver to be safe, but also no driver and no team will thank you for a heavy, safe but slow car. So you are, as you say, walking this kind of tightrope of trying to make the car as quick as possible, but making sure that you're not doing anything obviously or blatantly unsafe. Thankfully, and I think this is all credit to the FIA, in particular to the late Sid Watkins, who really led the charge on the safety regulations research. The regulations now are very thorough on the safety side.
Mm-hmm.
in a good way. And that means that horrible conundrum that designers used to face is not really present anymore. Where it still can be present is if the car suffers damage in a race, is it safe to continue, or should we retire the car, that sort of thing. And that's still a judgment, and a judgment that I've had to make a few times. Thankfully made the right judgment, in as much as the car went on to, in some cases, win the race despite damage. Certainly didn't result in an accident. It's a fine line.
Yeah. Well, I think it's common practice to have a post-race debrief with the driver and the race engineers. Is that usually a productive meeting? Is there a lot of finger pointing and yelling at? Maybe bring me in the room and one of these meetings here.
Well, the first thing you can almost invariably say is that if a car's fast or the driver thinks it's fast, he's very complimentary of the handling of the car.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Suddenly, then somebody else goes quicker. Suddenly, that same car's not handling as well as it did a few hours ago. And so there's definitely a bit of that when it comes to post-race debriefs. If you've won the race and everything's been good, then everybody tends to be less critical than if it hasn't. And that's something which can lead to complacency if you're not very careful. And as soon as complacency starts to creep in, then that is almost invariably a slippery slope, because then by the time you suddenly start to lose your competitive edge and other people start pushing you, your response time at that point is probably going to be too slow and you're going to get overtaken. So, and that's, I think, certainly in 1999 when I was at McLaren, Michael Schumacher broke his leg at Silverstone. And up until then, we'd been having a tight battle, Mika Hakkinen and McLaren, as I was responsible for, against Michael and the Ferrari. And then we just looked such an easy sweep to the rest of the year that we just started making mistakes left, right, and centre. And we did lose the constructors and almost lost the drivers. So, and I think that was for me a big lesson, that you've always, no matter what your success is, you've got to keep pushing and you've got to keep sharp.
Well, speaking of pushing, you designed this RB19 car that is, I think, the most successful Formula One car in history. It either has won 21 out of 22 races or 22 out of 20, something just mind-blowing, which brings me to the fun topic for me. I don't know about you, which is driver versus car. So how much of success do we attribute to the car design versus the driver ability? Because these are races, I imagine, won by fractions of a second here. So how do we think about this?
Well, I think at a fundamental level, then, Formula One, you've got three key ingredients into the performance, which is the driver, the chassis, and the engine, what's now called the power unit because of the electrical side. And you can probably afford for one of those to not be best as long as it's close. But if one of those is very weak, you might sneak the odd race win, but you won't win the championship. I don't think it's an easy answer. If you see the cars line up 2 by 2 in terms of the two teammates are very similar places on the grid, then you'd probably say that it's down to the car at that point. If there's a big disparity, then you say that between teammates, then you say that the driver's making a big difference. But that's also down to how tricky the car is at the time. At the moment, the Red Bull, I'll be honest, has probably got a little bit more tricky through the recent races to drive, and that's meant that there's been a bigger difference between Max and Checo than there has been previously. So you do get these local warpings depending on the car. But I think at a much more fundamental level, what I think is actually fascinating about Formula One is this man and machine aspect. That a lot of my friends from university on the aeronautical course, they of course then went off to work for aeronautical companies, particularly British Aerospace or Rolls-Royce engines. And there they would be working on projects that would not be flying for 10, 15 years even. So they were working on things where they were getting absolutely zero feedback of whether they're going good, bad, or indifferent. Whereas motor racing, then you've got this feedback every 2 weekends or so when you're out at the circuit, and that, of course, painful when you're doing badly, but at least you know where you are, and it gives you a target to set for. And I think from a sort of an enjoyment of the job or satisfaction from the job, that's the thing that I've really enjoyed. Because if I go back to university again, then I've kept in contact with or know of at least 10 or more of the 20 or so that were on the aeronautical course in my year, and only one of those is still, apart from myself, is a practicing engineer still. And I think that's such a shame that companies in engineering aren't stimulating enough for people to stay in it for a whole career. In the past, I think it's changing. I think people are getting better, and certainly a lot of the sort of startup American companies, from what I understand, are really quite exciting to work for. But engineering in the UK, sometimes it's not given the kind of interest and credit that it should have, and motor racing is definitely an exception there.
Formula One it's a high stakes game, a lot of money at stake. Pressure is constant. I read in one of the interviews you did, you said that you're actually at your most creative when the pressure is on, and it feels a little bit counterintuitive, because I would think excessive pressure maybe would push you to focus and do whatever is most efficient, to hit the important milestones, versus facilitating what I would imagine is a more open-ended, creative process, back to that earlier discussion. So I'd love to hear more about how you're able to use the pressure to facilitate the creative process itself that's so critical here.
So there's two types of pressure. There's the pressure that kind of you really feel on your shoulders all the time, and that's probably stifling. It can, as you say, lead to creative block because you just feel overwhelmed and overburdened. But then if you can learn to manage that side of it and just use the pressure as a point of focus, then I find that pressure can be very good, because the pressure means that you're spending more time thinking about the problems, particularly in the subconscious brain, I think. So that then if you go to sleep kind of with a problem nagging away at you, then you might wake up in the middle of the night, or it might pop up, a solution might pop up in the shower the following morning, or whatever it might be, because the subconscious is working away, trying to find a solution. If you're totally relaxed and not thinking about a problem at all, in my case, motor racing is the last thing I'm thinking about, then probably there's no challenge for the brain, so it doesn't come up with solutions. That's kind of the way I loosely interpret it, but it is, I think, a lot to do with how you manage it. So, as I say, very often when my brain manages to come up with solutions, it's out of nowhere in an unexpected place. The shower, on a flight, I find flying very useful, because I think typically on a flight, a bit bored, there's no time pressure, and that, I think, frees the creative brain, because you're not under pressure to do the next thing. There's no, haven't got a timetable on the plane to stick to, and you haven't got a meeting coming up in 30 minutes that you need to get, or a drawing that you need to get out by the end of the day.
But have you had periods where you've just gotten this creative block, the creative wells just run dry, like writer's block, and the harder you try, the worse it is? Does that happen, to you? And if that happens, is there something you do to get yourself unblocked, or is it just letting go of it, trying to free your mind, and hopefully, like you said, you're in the shower or on a plane or somewhere, and suddenly inspiration hits?
Typically, I find it's definitely time of year dependent. So obviously with in Formula One, we work to a cycle, and that means that the research and design period for the following year's car will typically be starting if there's no big regulation change, it will be starting in sort of April, May time. And by the time you get to, let's say, October, November, then the core of the car is being released. It's gone through the design process and it's being released to manufacture. Mm-hmm. There's, of course, still work going on, and then the work never stops, particularly nowadays where before the car even runs, you'll be working on the next upgrade because you have a lot of upgrades through the season, lots of revisions through the season. But I do find that by the time we got to late November into December through January, I find is my least creative time, because you kind of put all the ideas into the following year's car and then run out effectively. The guys keep going because they're perhaps more disciplined than I am, and they're then working away, developing the details and going on to the next evolution. But I start to find I dry up a little bit. And that's my solution for that particular one, actually, just this point, and take a bit of holiday time, just relax and kind of go again. And I do find that then when the car first runs, you get comments and feedback from the driver, you see the data, and invariably at the same time, all the other cars, the competitors, are also running. So you see what they've been up to over the winter. And so those are both sources of inspiration, and kind of off you go again. Because it's problem solving with your own car, and you're also busy perhaps looking at trying to understand what other people have been up to. It is that sort of thing of trying to be focused enough to have things always spinning around in subconscious, but not feeling pressured to the point that you get writer's block. That's probably the easiest way of putting it.
Yeah. Well, it was recently announced that you will be leaving the Red Bull racing team. You've been there for, God, how long now? Like a couple decades or something? A long time.
18 and a bit years, which is way longer than I've ever been at any other team.
Yeah. And there's a lot of speculation where you might end up. But here's what I'd like to know. You could retire. You could walk away today. You could have retired a decade ago, probably 20 years ago. I know that the kind of money you pull in, you've been at the peak of race car design for decades. So when you've been doing what you do with the success you've had for that long, what keeps you motivated?
First of all, well, it's that old thing, work to live or live to work. As we mentioned earlier, I'm lucky enough to be doing the job that I've wanted to do since I was 10 or 11. And I guess my enjoyment is trying to add performance to the car in any way. And that is multifaceted. So it's talking to the drivers, it's talking to my fellow engineers here at Red Bull, it's talking to the mechanics. And each day is very different. Sometimes I have a day planned out in my head as I drive into work, and then the day turns out completely different. And that's quite stimulating, actually, in a funny way. So I still enjoy the job. I have to admit, I was starting to feel a bit tired, and I felt as if I needed a bit of a break and some fresh stimulation. I had a similar feeling at McLaren in 2005, where we actually had a very good car that year. We won 10 races, but by the end of the year, I was just feeling a bit flat and felt as if maybe writer's block, or I don't know if it was writer's block, more kind of fatigue and not quite enjoying it as much and not feeling as creative, starting to creep in. And as you say, I'm in the very lucky position that I don't need to do it. I only do it because I want to. So the easy thing for me would be to stay at Red Bull, just keep counting statistics and kind of, if you like, and but I'm not that person. I want to do it because for my own esteem, value, pride, enjoyment, obviously, I think more than any of those other words, adjectives. And if I'm not really feeling absolutely motivated and on top of it, then I feel I'm not being honest to myself. So for that reason, I thought, okay, well, now's time to take a bit of a break. So with my wife and our dogs, we've been doing a little bit of travelling, and we'll continue to do so. It also allows me to put more work into the LV17, the track car. It's just been a kind of a weekend and evening project to an extent, because I've been trying to juggle two hats, but now I can do that. And it's been a really enjoyable one, so I'm not in any way complaining about that. It's been fantastic.
Do you still race cars yourself on the side?
Yes, I do. So I did. I hadn't done very much recently, but I brought my old Ford GT40 over to La Laguna Seca race, which is out near Monterey, and did a couple of races there. First time I've actually driven a car in the States, which I absolutely loved. It was actually one of my favourite events, not least because everybody in the paddock was so welcoming. The kind of spirit and atmosphere of racing in America seems to be so friendly. Sometimes, I'll be honest, that the European racing community can be a little bit bitchy. It's as if egos are a bit too big, but American racing doesn't seem to be like that at all. So that was a really unexpected and very pleasant surprise. And on the basis of that, then I took the car over to Daytona for the classic 24-hour race and shared the car with Jim Farley, the Ford CEO, who's also a very good friend of mine. So, and that was again a very special event to be sharing the car with Jim and just enjoying it. So I did that, and then in May this year I did the Monaco Historic in my old Lotus 49, which it's actually the third time I've raced it there. But to be taking an ex-Graham Hill Lotus Gold Leaf Lotus 49 around Monaco is always such a privilege, because that car was very special to me. I think, as I mentioned right at the start, it was that Tamiya 12th scale model that kind of set me on the path of what I do now. And so to be able to drive that same car and try to kind of enjoy it in a very different way is fantastic.
You seem to relish it as much today as you did decades past.
I do, yeah. I mean, I think that's the other thing is my father. He retired quite early. He kind of semi-retired at 62 and then fully retired at 65. And I think he ultimately he did actually miss working a bit, perhaps more than he had anticipated in terms of the stimulation and the challenge that work can provide. And if I look at the two of the people I admire the most, which is Benny Eccleston and Roger Penske, I've asked both of them, what keeps you so young and sharp? Because both of them are, relative to their years. You'd never guess how old they are when you talk to them. And both of them said, keep working. And so I think in my heart of hearts, I'm looking forward to, or I am taking a bit of a break now, apart from the work with the 17. But I know in my heart of hearts that kind of after a year of doing that, I'd be getting a bit bored and wanting to do something.
Yeah.
Not saying that'll be Formula One, but I'm 65, but I don't feel I'm ready to just lie on the beach.
You're very, very young, 65. I would tell you that, certainly in spirit. We will conclude with this. It's how I wrap up the podcast. It's called The Art of Excellence that you're on. And the question, Adrian, is how do you think of the word excellence? What does it mean to you?
I guess excellence that's a very good question. It's probably doing something to the ultimate, to the best of the ability at that time. That's not necessarily the best of one's own ability. Of course, it becomes, if you like, a personal best, a personal excellence. But excellence ultimately, I think, is something that if you look back in history and you can look at odd shining beacons then those would, I would say, are beacons of excellence.
Fantastic. Well,
and I have to ask you about your Disney design either, because that sounds a whole different.
Well, I was the I wasn't the creative, design engineer. I was the boring strategy and finance guy, but I got to work with some of the most incredible, talented people I've ever worked with in my life. It was something else.
I was lucky enough to visit the Mission Impossible set a few weeks ago.
Oh yeah,
and
because they're filming over. Are they filming in France? Where are they filming?
Studios, Longcross Studios, which is actually very close to where we live. And so I went over to visit, and Tom Cruise very kindly spent most of the day kind of walking me around and explaining everything. He's got such an enthusiasm for everything.
Well, he does a lot of his own stunts, as you know.
Oh, absolutely. But just the level of detail he gets involved in on everything was mightily impressive. And they have a huge gimbal. I hope I'm not giving any secrets here, and Tom doesn't have a word with me afterwards. But they have a huge gimbal there for filming the set. I won't go into any more detail on that at the moment. That's part of Mission Impossible, and it's a mightily impressive piece of engineering, I must say.
It must have been deja vu when you saw me on the video, having just seen Tom Cruise, right?
Absolutely.
Maybe my next life, I'll be a fraction of that guy's looks. Adrian, I loved every minute. I loved sort of taking a ride through F1, through your book and all the research I did, and what a fascinating career. Thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing some news about where you might turn up next.
Thank you very much. Well, and you have a great time. Great to chat.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, here's my ask of you. First, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the show. You can find it on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Second, tell a friend. Better yet, share it with all your friends and contacts on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Honestly, wherever you hang out online is fine with me. Please leave me a review if you could on iTunes or Spotify or both. The reviews really do help. And finally, try to find one takeaway from this episode that you can apply to your own life. Commit to trying something, anything. As the saying goes, no harm in trying. I leave you with this one question. How do you define the word excellence?